We are entrenched in a series that is called Today's Topics, Young Voices. And we've had the opportunity to hear from people who are really entrenched in very important work that affects our communities at large. And we've been able and blessed to hear the perspective of young people as they engage in their work community. Originally, we had the opportunity to welcome Danya, who shared with us how social media is a very important tool in Israel advocacy. We continue to hear that as we listen to the news, how important that war is, if you will, that battle certainly. We had the opportunity to hear from Shira Wallach, who spoke to us about the Israel College Coalition and her work in trying to frame the experience of anti-Semitism and hatred directed towards Jewish students on campus. Today, we're going to have the opportunity to have Leor share with us. Leor is a licensed social worker and does some amazing work in our community. So I'd like if you could just start by, can you tell us a little bit about how it is that you got into social work?
So I began my journey to social work when I studied psychology at Binghamton University. During that time, I was very much interested in human behavior and understanding how and why people behave in the way that they do. During that time, I really started to learn about understanding people within the context of their environment and the various factors that play into people's experience as well as their mental health. Afterwards, I began working at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where I did clinical research. And in interacting with patients, I really saw that importance come to life, really understanding each patient with a unique experience and attending to them in a way that was appropriate for them specifically. I then pursued my master's in social work, where I learned both about social justice as well as clinical work. And from there, I've been working at the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services for almost a year and a half, doing clinical work, individual and group therapy with specifically members of the Jewish and Hasidic community.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us that background. You know, it's sort of an interesting idea. If we think we all have some type of connection to psychology, social work, etc., that we can trace back, we know from our own studies, right? We think about Freud and psychoanalysis, the 1890s, etc. Everybody knows about id, superego, ego. If I throw out some terminology, transference, projection, a little Oedipus complex, everybody's comfortable until you get to there. But it used to be the case, actually, and I want to ask you about that. I think it's very important that it used to be the case that if somebody was quote unquote in therapy, there was this huge stigma attached to it. And today, it's almost the opposite. I feel badly, I'm not actively in therapy today. Can you comment on why, at least in a societal construct, that we've become more open to the work that therapists can help us with?
It's a great question. I think in part it's because people are understanding that to be in therapy, nothing necessarily has to be, or people aren't broken. We're not trying to fix individuals. What we're doing is finding a way to support people in a way that works for them. And I think once people have understood more so what therapy is, people have become more open to it. With that being said, within more traditional or religious communities, and the work I do with Hasidic communities, there is still a big stigma in seeking support and being in therapy or utilizing other resources for that matter.
Right, and I guess that's in part because it is such an insular community, which actually in some of your writing, you suggested that your being an outsider may be actually beneficial. So I'm going to hold that for just 1 second, but I want the people to understand the lens through which you do your therapeutic work. And again, some of this terminology we've heard, psychoanalysis, we think to ourselves, dream therapy, repressed memories, etc. There was an in vogue terminology called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and you work within an extension of that framework called dialectic behavior therapy. Can you just comment briefly so we know the angle that you're coming from? What does it mean to perform therapy under the lens of dialectic behavioral therapy?
So when we talk about CBT, we're looking at changing negative beliefs, which stem from core beliefs that we all have as people, which are shaped by our experiences throughout life. DBT really focuses on accepting those feelings, sitting with them, and also moving through them. I work with people who are survivors of domestic violence. So a lot of the time, being able to identify distressing emotions and then being able to manage them and cope with them is what's really most helpful on a day-to-day basis.
Got it. Okay. So let's hone in. We're going to hone in a little bit on this work that you do in the Hasidic community, because that's something that we're probably less familiar with. But I just want to throw it again, one more term for us to understand, which is the idea of trauma-informed care or trauma-informed lens. Can you just give us a sense of what that is? Because the work that you're doing, which is pretty unique, it's not just like me, you know, I'm going through life, I have this problem, I have that problem, I want to sit with a therapist. But when somebody's experienced trauma, I assume that engages you in a completely separate way. If you could comment, please.
Yeah. So many people have experienced trauma in different forms. And coming with a trauma-informed lens is understanding those different experiences and also understanding that you're not going to understand each one of those different experiences. When I work with individuals who are survivors of domestic violence, I have an idea of things that may have occurred in their lifetime and understanding their need for a safe space and a space where they can feel they have trust with their therapist is so important. So really just being empathetic, listening to their experiences and being non-judgmental to create that sense of emotional and physical safety.
Tell me about the following. So we commented before, so you're doing some work specifically with Hasidic clients. Mm-hmm. Why is it more comfortable for them to speak to you? What do you have in terms of your listening skills and your own background that even makes it a possibility that somebody from a very insular community is going to open up to you?
I actually have a really big advantage in this sense because when I work with people who are Hasidic or Orthodox, we actually do have a lot of similarities and we have some sort of instant connection. People feel comfortable working with someone else who is Jewish, who can understand them from a certain perspective without having to say anything. And that's really comforting to my clients. And then in addition to that, I am not within that insular community. And it's very clear presentation-wise that I am not a Hasidic Orthodox woman. And having that sense of other also creates a sense of safety and it takes away a lot of judgment. If they were working with an individual therapist who was part of that community, there is a lot more like stigma, like we just mentioned, to talk about various aspects of their relationships and just their daily lives.
I think thank you for that answer. And I think that there's in the Jewish community, I don't know it's particularly true with the Hasidic community, but I know that the Jewish board, which employs you, has an extensive program that's referred to as the LAVE Initiative and the Makom Shalom Network, both of which offer different services for these types of people who are coming from these situations. Can you give us a little bit of some ideas about what the Makom Shalom Network is, please?
Yes. So within the LAVE Initiative at the Jewish Board, our focus is primarily with domestic violence. So we work with mostly women and also children who have been impacted by domestic violence in some capacity. Some women that I work with are still in their relationships and either making the choice whether to leave or to stay and what that might look like. And I also work with women who have left their relationships and are experiencing trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder related to the traumatic events that they've experienced. The Makom Shalom Network is a group of nonprofit agencies, specifically within the Jewish community, that work to provide resources to adults, women, families who are experiencing leaving an abusive marriage, an abusive relationship, and other other cases where housing is needed, food is needed, legal services is needed, and having that network where people understand the unique needs of Hasidic people is really important. For example, when women that I work with are looking to leave abusive marriages and are looking for emergency shelter, sometimes they run into the issue of having kosher food, right? A New York City shelter doesn't necessarily account for that.
And certainly not glut kosher, right?
Yes, definitely not. So having a network that can understand that, okay, you're in a New York City shelter. Okay, now what's the food pantry that we can connect you with? So that way you can have kosher food. There's also the importance of being in a shelter with other observant people. That's a sense of discomfort when you're leaving an abusive relationship. There are already so many challenges that you're facing, and to be in a shelter or with women or other people who are not observant can be very uncomfortable and scary.
I imagine, and I'm not being facetious, but I imagine it is not so easy to keep Shabbos in a woman's shelter in New York City, right?
Correct. It depends for each person.
Is there such a thing that's set up that they can? Okay. So there's this whole extra step that these people have to get through. Let's think about for a moment how we perceive the hierarchy and the power dynamic in an ultra-Orthodox community. So we know from the writings of Bria Kay and others who suggest that there's an inherent hierarchy, right? The hierarchy is certainly the husband, but perhaps even above that is the Rebbe, right? But certainly the husband. And even the way Jewish law is set up, whereby the husband has to give the woman the get, the divorce paper. Otherwise, she's tied to that marriage, becomes an aguna, and has no possible future for herself. Is the way that family structure is set up, as some articles suggest, does that lead to inevitable abuse of power?
That's a really great question. And I think from an outside perspective, and even my own opinion, yes, to an extent, right? If the man has the ultimate decision to give over again and finalize the marriage, terminate the marriage, that is not a fair dynamic, power dynamic. However, I think it is more complex. I think people within the community don't see that as an unfair power dynamic. They see that as in line with different teachings and structures within the community.
Tell us a success story.
So I had one client who, she's about 70 years old, and she was in an abusive relationship. Her husband was physically, emotionally, psychologically abusive. And when she first came to me, she was pretty much in crisis, and she had joined a support group of ours, which was for women who were in abusive relationships. We met for a couple of weeks, and unfortunately the group terminated because we had very few clients, which speaks to the stigma that still exists actually within the Hasidic community with mental health. And she was open to having individual support. So she and I met for a number of weeks, and at the beginning of our sessions, she was really dealing with a lot of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically complex post-traumatic stress, meaning that she had been experiencing multiple traumatic events throughout her life. Some of those symptoms included flashbacks, nightmares, avoiding certain places or certain things that would remind her of the traumatic event, the ones in the past versus the present. And she was really having a difficult time. During our time together, we focused a lot on DBT. So we did a lot of emotional regulation and distress health. So noticing when she was feeling nervous and anxious and how to manage those feelings. One of the really interesting things that we worked on was creating a safety plan for her. Because her husband was physically abusive, it was important to understand that we can't sit here and change how he works and how he responds. what we can do is our best to create a safer, kind of create some harm reduction in that scenario. So finding spaces within the house that are dangerous, having an escape plan, being near a door. And one of the really unique challenges that we came up with the safety plan was what to do on Shabbat. Because on Shabbat, she can't just call her friends if she's feeling stressed out. She can't go over necessarily to her neighbor's house or her friend's house for support. So what was she going to do for Shabbat? And together we worked towards finding a way where she was going to be in a situation that was safer and less stressful. So she knew that when she and her husband were with friends for Shabbat, he was less physically abusive. He was less likely to become physical and to be as even emotionally and psychologically abusive as well. So during our time together, that we found a plan for her to be in New Jersey with friends, so that way she could have a more peaceful and pleasant Shabbat. We were also able to talk about different resources that she could use if she did need emergency shelter and housing thereafter, and ways in which she could seek support that she didn't know existed. And with all of that, by the end of our sessions, she was able to really identify areas in which she was really strong, and areas that she could use to her own benefit. And while she was still deciding whether to stay in her relationship, she was able to manage the day-to-day a lot better.
Hello.
It sounds like you're doing some of the
Hi,
groundbreaking work
Stephanie. How are you
in
today?
the community. I don't know if you're familiar, but whether it's mental health or other issues, there's an organization in Brooklyn which is called Amudim, which specifically works with addiction issues. And the gentleman who opened Amudim a few years ago, when he first announced that he was going to have a program for parents of kids who were addicted, whether it be alcohol or other substances, that he had expected 3 or 4 people to show up at a shul-based midrash that he had opened. And he was shocked that actually the place was packed. And they continue to do great work. So do you see the work that you're doing in the Jewish board, the work from the Shalom, the Makom Shalom entity, the LAVE initiative? Do you feel that it's making a difference day to day for people?
I definitely do. I know that it's making a difference. I've asked women in our groups, how are you feeling today? And at the end of the group, we talk about what they take away from that day, what resonated with them. And a big piece of it is just that someone asked them how they were doing and actually caring to hear the answer and knowing that they could share their real thoughts and feelings without judgment, without stigma, without pressure. So I know from firsthand experience that women are getting support from myself and with other women, like within these groups that we have, from one another, seeing that they're not alone, that this is a problem within the Hasidic community as well as the general population, but that they're not alone and that there are resources to support them. All of things which, a month prior, they may not have known even existed.
Well, I think that's fantastic, groundbreaking work. That it's not for us to complete the entire project, but it sounds like you're making great strides. And we know the importance of the concept of shalom in Jewish tradition. Every single time that we say an Amidah, the last blessing is Hamavarech et Amo Yisrael Ba. Beautiful. We sing together, Oseh, etc. And even going back to the times of the Talmud and going to, if we look at Rambam's work in his halachic compendium of the Mishnah Torah, it talks about the following scenario. It says that you come home and it's Hanukkah, and you only have enough oil to light one of 2 types of lamps, either the Chanukiah, or, again, if we think about it as an androcentric text, or to make lights in the home for your family. One might think that, oh, we should light the Hanukkah candles. No, the halacha is the different approach. It says, no, you have to take care of your family first. You light the candles for the family first. Why? Because shalom bait is kodem. To making sure that everybody in your house is comfortable is more important than the mitzvah of Hanukkah. And believe it or not, it says the same thing about Shabbat, right? That if you can only afford either to light the house for the family or to do the Shabbos candles, it says do it for the family, because the idea of shalom bayit, and bringing peace into the home is the highest of value in Jewish tradition. So I think that I want to applaud the work that you're doing. I think it's fantastic. It's groundbreaking. And I hope that after our services that many of you will have the opportunity to introduce yourself to Leor and to ask her about some of the great work that she's doing in the Hasidic community. All I can say is your parents must be very proud.